Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you is the overlap of alcohol, genetics, and a variety of health conditions, and not necessarily obviously so. We have a particular neurological discovery of sorts, and the relationship with psychoses, or effectively many of the symptoms and a temporary effect of schizophrenia. The bizarre zombie-like disease that has been spreading through deer in the USA, which now uncomfortably has spread to 2 humans. Can somebody find either Alice or Claire Redfield? The T-virus appears to be out and about again. We have an unfortunate ruling in the Philippines, where, due to bureaucratic regulations, golden rice has been banned once more, although this ban may be in vain hope. Pesticide residue results and the bullshittery associated with various environmentalist group claims. The source of the vast majority of plastic pollution in the world. Physics and time, or at least a time in an hourglass. And the bizarre effect that your initials could have on grading. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with alcohol, and not necessarily excessive drinking, but certainly it's related to it. There's a juncture between genetics and the impact of alcohol on you. Now, this juncture is not just limited to things like the cheap date gene, wherein you will be very quickly and very easily intoxicated, hence the rather entertaining name. Rather, it is the downstream effects, such as your heart or liver, that are affected by consumption of alcohol, and what genes that might impart a certain degree of protection to these downstream organs when you drink to excess. Now, to be very clear about this, the study is very detailed and, well, to be frank about it, relatively strong, but it is purely observational, and that's a key thing here. The observation is rather straightforward. Take over 3 million DNA records and look at what are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. Now, much like the polymorph juice in Harry Potter, these are mutations or changes in the genome, but as the name suggests, it's a single nucleotide that is either the adenine, guanine, thymine, or cytosine that have been changed, rather obviously swapping out one or the other. In this case, these single mutations are able to, for lack of a better phrase, completely alter the small region of the DNA in which they're found, and this small change but big impact can have, well, just that, a big impact, and in this case, the curiosity of downstream protection to your liver, heart, and other organs. The broad effect, so to say, is that these mutations that benefit you have, for the vast majority, increase the rate of metabolism, wherein you convert ethanol into acetaldehyde. This allows for less time, let's say, for the alcohol that you've consumed to have that adverse effect. Although it also means that you would theoretically sober up considerably faster, which, depending on the context of your drinking habit, may or may not be of benefit. In other news that's clinically relevant, or perhaps more clinically relevant, we have a combined transplant, and it's partly developments on existing clinical news, and partly completely new. It's the combined transplanting of both a heart pump and a pig kidney. This combination is what makes it somewhat unique. First of all, we have the simple fact that it's a genetically modified pig kidney. The modifications, as previously explained, are intended to make them relatively inert to the immune system. That is, the normal antigens that are present on the kidney cells shouldn't be picked up by the immune system, because they're not there. This means the immune system has no reason to attack the kidney, thereby achieving several benefits, one of which is simply that there are a lot of pigs, and most of those pig kidneys aren't used in terms of food, so theoretically it would be useful that, well, we have all these kidneys available, they could be transplanted. Of course, these genetically modified kidneys are grown in very special conditions, so these pigs are not going to ever be used for food. But the other reason is you don't need anywhere near as much in terms of immunosuppressant medication, which is beneficial, rather obviously. There are a variety of effects of suppressing the immune system that are not good. The other part to this is the rather obviously stated heart pump, which was implanted prior to the kidney, but it is the duality that makes this unique for the most part. There is the other fact that this is the first living recipient of a GMO pig kidney, as previously, although it was transplanted into a human, the human in question was brain dead. So it was more a proof of concept than it was an actual attempt to do something clinically important, for the individual at least. And in this case, the individual will be able to live more than the few weeks they had remaining. Shifting to a somewhat more widespread concern, at least in terms of things that are likely to be immediately useful, we have brain systems and psychoses. Psychosis is essentially many of the symptoms associated with things like schizophrenia, but generally speaking are much shorter lived. They can and do occur, particularly in juveniles, who through medication, counseling and so on, eventually find either ways to cope with or in some respects will grow out of it. But the cause is otherwise unknown. This is where two parts of the brain may be playing a major role. Now, understand, this is relatively early and relatively theoretical, but it is based on actual data, so we can at least apply what's been identified to some extent. The systems are involved in the filtering and processing of both internal and external information to predict what will happen down the track. Essentially, if this input occurs, what will happen, and do I need to worry, at least for your brain? The key here is that psychosis is not just limited to schizophrenia. Understand, you will identify it with these individuals, but you can also find it in bipolar disorder and in an atypical presentation of other neurological conditions, such as autism or ADHD. To that purpose, they took a large number of people, about 450 of them, with a range of psychological conditions, and they scanned their brains, unsurprisingly. They looked at the scans of these individuals and compared them to about 400 control people, and they began to try and figure out whether or not there was a distinction between these two groups, something unique and special. Now, doing this by hand or manually is completely and utterly ridiculous, so instead they used machine learning to try and do the same thing, and it does show the increasing importance of the ability to code in even biological sciences, or at least in this case anatomical and physiological sciences. This leads to what the machine learning algorithm found. There were two areas that were particularly distinct between the control and otherwise, let's say, unhealthy group or experimental group. The first was the anterior insula, a part of the salience network that allows us to direct our attention to what is important, and the other is the ventral striatum. This is a significant player in the dopamine-driven pathways that control what is effectively the reward and punishment system. That is to say that the previous research finding that the salience or attention identifying and essentially focusing network of your brain is being told that these signals are important, and then it's being rewarded for paying attention to these systems by virtue of the dopamine pathways in the ventral striatum. The significance of this research cannot be understated, mostly owing to three things. One is that this does provide new targets for psychoses and, to a larger extent, things like schizophrenia. Second, it does mean that medication that currently exists and has some incredibly nasty side effects. For example, wanting to consume coriander or cilantro can instead be either modified or hopefully done away with entirely in the case of some of these medications, in lieu of these better medications that will come out, or made less undesirable. Third and finally, it provides a identifiable pathway and mechanism for schizophrenia, amongst other conditions, that, for lack of a better phrase, allows us to better identify and diagnose these individuals, thereby providing them with better treatment options. Next we go to what could be described as microbial news, although in this case the microbial news is more going to horrify and disgust creationists. Those people who claim that there's no way for organisms to create what they are now through evolution. Rather, it requires that some divine being stepped in and molded, for example, the human being. The issue here is that's not necessarily so, and we now have direct and very clear evidence of the merger of two distinct organisms to create a new being, or at least organism. This would further not only support, but directly and clearly evidence the possibility that one of the major theories for how the human cell has become what it is has occurred, that being the presence of the mitochondria in the human cell. Now, before now it's been a thought, but less well evidenced, although that's perhaps a too broad a description, that the mitochondria was a complete and separate microbial organism that somehow got drawn into and taken over in cells that eventually became the human being. That's why the mitochondria has its own distinct set of DNA. But it also explains why it's somewhat weird and unique in terms of the organelles within cells. The research shows quite clearly that there's basically a once in a billion occurrence that two organisms have managed to do exactly that. One has managed to get sucked into the other, and not just being consumed, but it's been essentially drawn into and made part of. The phenomena is very similar to what, say, fungi in the form of mushrooms and living trees go through. There's a certain symbiosis. The host organism provides nutrition, protection, and more, and the, let's say, guest organism provides a variety of benefits to the host in turn. The reason this research is important, other than the fact that it's going to aggravate all kinds of creationists, is that it does demonstrate a way for microbial life to start with to acquire a variety of novel and, to a certain extent, more advanced tools from a completely separate organism, and that these advantages can then be passed on to successive generations that are, generated. In terms of this research, it specifically applies to a species of algae, and it has to do with not just the ability to use chloroplast to create energy through photosynthesis, but also the ability to fix nitrogen straight from the air and combine it with other elements to create necessary and useful compounds, for example, DNA. Oppenheimer had it half right when he said, "I am become God." Perhaps not destroyer of worlds, though. What might destroy the world is the zombie virus finding its way into deer. And it's a worrying concept, not just because deer are delicious, just don't tell Bambi, but that the zoonoses in these deer is just that, a zoonoses, meaning it's able to spread to humans, and that's a worry, because it has now. The case reports indicate that it's a form of prion disease, and that's not good. Prion diseases can be spread by consuming the protein of a organism infected by them. And as mentioned, deer is delicious. And because deer is delicious and it's a protein-based disease, the prion disease spreads to those who consume it. And assuming that you don't proceed to then consume the individuals who have hunted the deer, it won't spread from them, but it will spread from anybody else who consumes either deer that have been infected by it, or possibly deer that have been born from those who are already infected. The deer that have been infected in this case effectively have what Britain had in the 90s, a form of, mad cow disease or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, except it's in deer, hence the name it's been given, zombie deer disease. It is important for us to note that although the autopsies of the individuals, and there were similarities and overlap in the behaviour and history of the two, does indicate prion disease as being the cause, it is at least currently, a theory that that is what has caused them. That is the jump from the deer to humans, so you don't necessarily need to panic. On the other hand, you should perhaps be a little more careful and considerate in whether or not you're going to eat deer. And the other key to this is not just that you should be considerate about whether or not you're going to eat deer, but for the most part, it doesn't matter where in the USA and parts of Canada you're located. For the most part, this disease, so to say, is basically spread across the entirety of North America. So if you're a hunter in the United States or Canada, perhaps for now avoid the large, angry, horned creature, at least as far as food goes. In other related news, at least in terms of animals that we eat, it's the USDA getting a lot of, let's say, negative attention for disclosing the information that's currently available, and to be clear, limited information regarding avian influenza and, cattle. Now, we ourselves mentioned that there is some concern, but very little, in terms of the infection of avian influenza into particularly dairy cattle. And based on taking the available information and balancing its probability of actually infecting a human, and, being a sane individual who doesn't drink raw milk, there's not a great deal of concern. But nonetheless, the criticisms are aimed at the idea that the USDA has announced it, which seems kinda silly. The role of the USDA is to announce these sorts of events. Now, not necessarily with as little information as they did, which, to be clear, wasn't ideal, but nonetheless, that's their role. They're meant to share this. In short, the criticisms are basically a lack of knowledge about whether or not it's a one-off event, which, even if it is a one-off event, should still be announced to farmers so that they can take appropriate action, or alternatively, it's an actual zoonosis that is spreading from birds to cattle, and they've been able to establish an effective and stable mutation that enables it. The criticisms, for the most part, can be summarized as other countries throwing a hissy fit, mostly down to the fact that they want to know whether or not there should be concerns for their country. But the USDA should also be able to do this quicker than they have, so the criticisms are not without merit, just that they seem to be very much couched in a personal interest. Along the same lines, we have the continuing spread of avian influenza. Now, the spread of avian influenza is a concern, not just because of its rather obvious infection of cattle, but the possibility that it could infect swine, basically pigs for the most part. The reason there is concern, both for the previous news item and for avian influenza, is simple. Should, and this is a massive should, the avian influenza infect pigs, and the pigs are also infected with a more mundane but regular human influenza strain, there is the distinct ability that the two viruses could basically merge and create a supervirus. Well, not really. It's not like it's something like a Superman, Transformers, or whatever. It is just that when you have two viruses commingling in a cell, they can produce a undesired offspring. The mummy and daddy virus love each other very much kind of nonsense. The key here is that new virus will carry all of the issues associated with both the human influenza, that is the ability to infect humans, and all of the issues with the avian influenza, which can include things like extremely high mortality rates, which is a concern, obviously. and that's perhaps why at the moment the UN Health Agency is essentially ringing alarm bells. They already received a whole load of crap over COVID, and they don't want a repeat of it, particularly given not only COVID, but past avian influenza outbreaks where there were big problems. This is only further reinforced, let's say, by the fact that there have been humans infected by poultry, and so chickens for the most part. The key here is that it's not a human-to-human transmission, at least as far as any of the publicly available information goes, and some of the countries where this is most prevalent have been less than forthcoming. China. Anyway, the other countries that are more forthcoming in their data have basically all been able to show that all of the individuals infected have been directly infected by the birds they've been working with, basically large poultry farms. The importance to that is that it does mean that the virus has not had that hybridization event yet, where it is able to transfer between humans like regular human influenza does. But it does mean that the avian influenza has found a way to be able to access the human genome, and also access the human cells. Basically, it's found the key to the lock that it needs to get inside. Thankfully, not get inside and then infect someone else. This is great news for anybody not infected, but not great news for those who have been infected, as there's about a 52% fatality rate if you are infected with these various strains, but primarily looking at the H5N1 strain. This is also why the infection of cows with avian influenza is a worry. It's not just that, well, if the cows are infected and you are so stupid as to consume raw milk, you've basically just drunk a bottle of influenza that can infect you and has a more than 50% chance of killing you. It does mean that it's possible, and arguably likely eventually going to happen, that there will be a way for the virus to find a way to transmit itself between mammals, starting at least initially with either pigs or cows, and then, rather obviously, moving on to other mammals, like the naked ape, otherwise known as humans. Shifting to less ranching news and more agricultural news alone, we have golden rice in the Philippines, and reasons why groups like Greenpeace are celebrating by dancing on the graves of tens if not hundreds of thousands of children. And that's not a joke, that's pretty much what they're doing. Greenpeace, amongst other organizations, is celebrating the decision by the Philippines High Court to at least temporarily ban the approval of golden rice. The decision has been made on the premise that there's not a robust enough assessment process in the various agricultural departments of the Philippines government to assess the safety of golden rice. A safety profile that is basically no different from regular rice. Yeah, if you can eat plain rice, you can eat golden rice. The chances of you having any side effects are practically nil, unless you proceed to choose to eat an entire bag of rice. And at that point in time, you're more likely to have an issue with your stomach becoming perforated than you are vitamin A toxicity. And despite these issues, it does come down to the fact that, essentially, activist groups who have no concept of what they're doing, or arguably are just plain arseholes, have chosen to pursue this in the court, and that pursuit has led to it being banned. However, and there is a massive however to this, that ban has come into effect after farmers were already given access to golden rice seeds. That means that the seed is already out there and being grown. That also means that there are fields of golden rice being grown. Fields of golden rice that, even if they are banned, are unlikely to be taken out. The farmers are not going to be willing to take that huge loss. Secondary to that is that it means that the process of spreading golden rice has already started. And as much as the Philippines government may not like it necessarily in the form of the Supreme Court, although the Agriculture Department may disagree, and certainly groups like Greenpeace will disagree, they can't stop the spread now. The other noteworthy phenomenon to this is one of the rather asinine experts against golden rice. and we call them asinine for a simple reason. They've attributed golden rice to being part of big agricultural seed companies' efforts to suppress local cultivars of rice. Except golden rice isn't one of the big corporations' attempt to overpower communities. In fact, golden rice has been specifically developed and grown in such a way that it's accessible to individuals by a not big corporation. It basically means that one of the experts who was trying to explain why golden rice should be banned was talking out of their arse, and then some. In other similar news, we do have a development in terms of crops being modified to make them more easily, let's say, handled and farmed by robots, which would be ideal. It reduces the labor requirement to get our food. And the way they're doing this is very straightforward and simple. They're making things more colorful. When you have a camera, and the camera is going across a field, and it's trying to figure out is this thing a weed or not, it has to make a decision very quickly, and such quick decision making with relatively limited information can be prone to error. If, instead, you choose to engineer the plants in such a way that they show certain colors, and only certain colors in certain ways, it makes automatic weeding by robots much simpler, as all it needs to do is see that this certain color is present in a certain plant to then ignore that plant. The good news is we don't even really need to actually use any novel approaches to this. For example, you don't need to put the green fluorescent protein into these plants like you would say bacteria, a common laboratory experiment, to show the ability to genetically modify something. Instead, we can use existing genes, for example anthocyanins that make blueberries blue, or carotenoids which make carrots orange. These would have two benefits, first of which is simply they add color, but also they improve the nutritional profile of said food. Further to improving the nutritional profile and making weeding easier, it also decreases, at least in theory, the cost to a farmer through the use of things like pesticides and herbicides, mostly herbicides though, because they can look at what's not being sprayed, essentially send out the electronically charged robot, preferably charged through say solar panels, remove the weeds and not have to spray something. It means they don't have as much in the way of consumables. Sure, they would need to invest in not only the new seeds and the infrastructure and tools, but they would not need to rely on something that they're paying considerable amounts of money for. News related to pesticides, particularly, we have the EFSA's latest report. The EFSA is basically the European Food Safety Agency. More or less anyway. The importance of what they've published is, to be frank with you, overstated. Extremely overstated. First of all, in the major developments, just about all of the samples fell within the permitted levels. This shouldn't be a surprise. Beyond the fact that there's always going to be some anomalous data, there's also a very high probability that within the anomalous data set that they did find, the roughly 3.5%, that small subset of the wider food network is either going to be from particular regions who are notorious for not adhering to the rules, selected at poor times, or otherwise explainable reasons. It's not just random contamination. Further, within the area that actually follows and is under the relative control, or at least has a program in place to ensure proper controls, more than 98% were within legal limits. So we have about a 1% error rate. This brings us to the, let's say, figures that are being touted as a problem. First of all, the presence of a pesticide is not necessarily a sign of a problem. To be clear about it, just because you can detect something doesn't mean it's actually a problem. And this is down to the fact that although you may be able to detect the presence of something like residue of a pesticide, you may not be able to quantify it because it is so small. That is, even using incredibly sensitive detection equipment, there is so little of it that you can detect it, but you can't measure it. That is how low it is. More than half of the samples fell into this category. Further, another 47%, so we're basically talking about just about all of the samples now, contained one or more residues, but these were all below the permitted threshold. This means that they could detect it and they could quantify it, but there was so little of it that there's no sign that it would have an effect. Basically, in order to have any kind of adverse result, you would need to be consuming ridiculous amounts. And given that they were looking at things like apples, strawberries, peaches, wine, both red and white, lettuces, cabbages, tomatoes, spinach, oats, barley, and cow's milk, the amounts you would need to eat are significant to be able to get anywhere near a problematic dose. And then we had the remaining 1.5% that contained residues that were above the permitted levels. Understand, the permitted levels are only there to indicate that this could be a problem. The actual adverse effects aren't necessarily clear. And importantly, even if you were to buy organic, it doesn't mean you would be any better off. In other news, we have what is more an interesting article, and one that, depending on what you're doing, it could be useful. And the title tells you everything you need to know. Toward an open source 3D printable laboratory. It's quite simply, if you have a 3D printer and you have filament or resin for it, you can basically make the majority of equipment you will need to some extent. Understand, depending on what you're using, it may not be able to be autoclaved, which would mean it either have to be sanitized and sterilized different ways, or alternatively, it's basically a one-off use. But for specialized or bespoke tools, this is actually not that bad an idea. After all, you can quickly prototype and develop something, and then find better ways to make it that allow it to be reusable, or at least sustainable. The sustainability element is not something that can be understated, and not just for the fact that, to a certain extent in research, there is an uncomfortable amount of consumables, for example pipette tips. But in terms of real-world results, we should look at just 5 corporations, mostly because looking at 5 corporations will drastically lower the amount of waste that exists in the world. In fact, we can make an impact on about 24% of all plastic pollution just by targeting them. Admittedly, 24% of traceable plastic pollution, so understand that there's an important distinction there. Traceable in that we can figure out who's responsible, and if we can also figure out whether or not they're solely responsible. About 11% of this traceable plastic waste is blamable on Coca-Cola, and then 5% on Pepsi. You then have big companies like Nestle and Danone, which were also major players. And then finally, curiously enough, a tobacco company, Altria. It's not just that these companies are responsible, but importantly, these companies were responsible by auditing areas which were, for lack of a better phrase, high population density regions. Basically, where the most people are and the most traceable plastic pollution, who is responsible? Unsurprisingly, the overlap is there. But just 5 major companies are responsible for about 24%, and that's a big issue, particularly when the vast majority of this, let's say, waste is, for lack of a better word, from single-use products. As such, people use it, for example, consume their Coca-Cola, and then toss the bottle. If you want something to last, you have a few options, and, well, in the case of plastic bottles, they're never going to work. You could consider glass, but glass tends to be somewhat fragile. And then you could look at, say, steel or metals. These are fine, except they tend to be quite heavy, and that leaves you with only a few choices, and particularly if you want to be able to see the contents, you're going to have to look at something like a crystal, but crystals tend to be rather expensive and time-consuming to make, and they take millions of years. Except if you want to make diamonds now. Diamonds can be made in about 2.5 hours. That means that your expensive diamond engagement ring took about 2.5 hours to make, which is only slightly longer than it's going to take you to get divorced. The facetious relationship between diamonds and marriage aside, the novel approach is, at least, somewhat important, not because of the terrible jokes, but that timing and the low atmosphere requirement. While taking about 2.5 hours, it only needed 1 atmosphere, or basically room pressure, or what you're experiencing right now. The caveat to that is that although requiring almost no pressure and no atmosphere, it still needed high heat, just not anywhere near the same high heat you would otherwise expect. It's about 1000 degrees Celsius or about 1900 freedom units. This is significantly less than what you'll need to worry about for most crystal making efforts. All of this sounds great, except for one small caveat. In fact, it's actually small, which is the problem here. Although it doesn't take very long, at about 2.5 hours or 150 minutes, the actual product is only a few nanometers thick, which is probably thick enough for a wedding ring given how long you'll be using it. And that's the key here. They create thin, almost streams or plates of these diamond crystals. But that's it. They're thin, they're wide, and they're relatively, at least at this stage, not as useful for any showing off purposes. But that doesn't mean they can't be useful for something else. For example, industrial applications where, given the speed and productivity of this method, they would be desirable, mostly down to the fact that it's quick and, given the otherwise relatively low demands to make them, theoretically significantly cheaper. In other time-related research, we have physics and why it is that, at least for a hourglass, sand will occasionally just decide to stop flowing. And this is an oddity. If you've ever had a sand timer or hourglass, and you've thought, why have I so much time left, for example in a turn in a game? Or, why is my nice display piece not working the way expected? It would be because those odd granules of sand that otherwise behave like a liquid have suddenly started to act like a solid. The idea is basically that sand is behaving, in a manner of speaking, kind of like a non-Newtonian fluid. Most fluids, if they're following Newtonian rules at least, if you apply force to them, will freely move. However, non-Newtonian fluids will basically become a solid the moment you start applying a sudden but reasonably significant force to them. It's why in the past there have been idiots who have decided to make a massive pool full of custard and then walk across it, because they could, and to demonstrate the idea of non-Newtonian fluids, but mostly because they could. The research itself may not seem all that exciting, but it can be very important. There are rather obvious applications, for example in industry, where you have something that's somewhat granular passing continuously through a system, and you definitely don't want to jam. But in other terms, it can have more significance to you as an individual, for example, the flowing of solids through a sewage system. The researchers have figured out that there's older research from the 1950s that applies here, and basically it's the vibrational frequency of whatever is in the system and how they jostle together, and eventually when and how they will get stuck. Importantly, what they were trying to understand was not necessarily the what causes them to get stuck, but just when and how close you can get to that point of them being stuck. In news that's otherwise technology related, but not as useful for the most part, the idea of an invisibility cloak. Well, in this case, it's a crowdfunding attempt to sell an invisibility cloak for various, stupid technological developments. Basically, humanity relying more on computers and cameras than it is to rely on, actual humans. The device is very simply a massive concave. This massive concave screen has an effect on the way a light hits it, and what the light does is it reflects off it in such a way that you perceive that whatever is directly behind it is completely invisible. It's not so different to the idea that is used for certain telescope lenses, except that they're trying to achieve exactly the opposite effect. The caveats to the product on the Kickstarter page are somewhat obvious, and honestly not particularly useful. The caveat to it is that, well, you want to be in front of a relatively homogeneous or uniform background. That way it doesn't appear that, well, you're actually just randomly throwing stuff in front of you. It would kind of give away the illusion. But the second is that the effect that is described works both ways. That is, you can't see out and nobody can see in, which isn't ideal if you're trying to be able to do exactly what an invisibility cloak, or in this case invisibility board, generally is going to be for. So no sneaking into the change rooms of the girls and peeking on it, boys. Shifting from Kickstarter and kind of crazy creative ideas, or at least creative application of known ideas in physics, we have what is arguably, to be frank with it, something of a stupid cry about racism and other similar nonsense. It's arguments that your grades could be impacted by your initials, which, yeah. Alrighty, let's go through the dump. The general gist of what they have tried to do is look at 30 million student records of assessments submitted and what grade was given. Now, in theory, this sounds great, except when you look at how the assessments are graded and the process used to do so. Generally speaking, any automated system will try and use something like either student numbers, that is your student identifier, to be able to list students in sequence, or alternatively, they'll use the student name. Now, the name thing here is where it gets to be important. If your surname, generally speaking, or family name, if you will, is going to be in the start of the alphabet, you will be higher up in that list, simply because it starts with A and will end with Z. The key here is that if you are in those first students and you have a common assessor, the assessor is not going to start with one student and then go, okay, I've marked one individual, time to take a break. They'll do 3 or 4 at a time, and they'll just keep going until they either run out of time in their workday, they get interrupted, or more likely, they simply have to sleep. And that's the key here. They will just progressively work their way through assessments. The 0.3 gain out of 100 possible points, so it's a 0.3% benefit in being in the first 5 letters of the alphabet, versus the 0.3% loss in being in the last letters of the alphabet, isn't significant for that reason. And that shows just how little impact that the actual initials will have on your grading in those terms. It's not the initials themselves. It's the relatively pragmatic and practical approach to presenting student assessments to be marked. If you've ever spent time marking assessments, you will find that initially you start either very strictly adhering to the requirements of a rubric or similar, and you basically go through it that way, and you start off strict and gradually get more relaxed as you look at how students you've initially marked compared to students who have presented their work later on. This tends to be the approach taken. Secondary to that is the possibility of starting out slightly more strict, and therefore those students lose marks, so you adhere as hard to it as you can, and then you give more marks as you go, as you realize that students are presenting it this particular way. You learn more about your cohort. It has less to do with the, as mentioned, actual student naming than it does with the simple reality of having an individual mark assessments. Humans are, to a certain extent, flawed beings, and this is just a demonstration of that. It has less to do with the person's name and more to do with humans being humans. And the final news item we have for you this week is, well, the kind of craziness of China. And China being China, it has unique elements to it. One of these unique elements is their massive explosion in population. They are, if not the, one of the two biggest nations in the world as far as population goes. This huge population needs to live somewhere, and, well, they rather obviously live in cities. But their cities are notorious in different ways. One of the ways they're notorious is for tofu-dread construction. That is when their buildings are made so cheap and so badly that they literally fall apart like the dregs of tofu. This has been found to apply in various contexts. For example, in various bridges that have quite literally fallen to bits, with vehicles and people on them. In other cases, it's not so important in terms of tofu-dread construction, but it does demonstrate the problem with these cities being built. It's satellite imaging showing that some of China's major cities, in fact half of China's major cities, are sinking into the ground, very slowly but very surely. These cities are sinking at a rate of more than 3 millimeters a year for at least half of those cities that were studied, and about 16% are sinking at a rate of about 10 millimeters a year. Now, for those of you who use freedom units, it's about 1/8 of an inch to about 2/5 of an inch a year, which is a big number. Understand that if you live in a house for just 10 years, you will have sunk about 10 centimeters or 1/3 of a foot, and in other cases it may be something along the lines of nearly an inch and a bit. So that's not an insignificant number. The causes for this are surprisingly straightforward, which, given the lack of transparency of China, knowing this is kind of amazing. For the most part, it boils down to issues around sedimentation, the sediment itself compressing, the lack of groundwater available, which helps to plump up that sediment, and, to a certain extent, just the rate at which they're extracting the groundwater itself. On top of all of that, you have simply the size of these cities. That is, the cities are so big and so heavy that they are just squishing everything in that area. The worry with all of this is kind of straightforward. In combination with tofu-dread construction, you now have the at least ground-based structural integrity of these buildings being negatively affected. As you can imagine, when you start combining cheap and shoddy construction with ground-based structural issues, suddenly your incredibly expensive building that you and possibly several generations of your family have saved up to buy just one house in is going to lose all of its value. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.